December 1944, 3rd Army Headquarters in northeastern France operates under a cloud of dense exhaust and freezing fog. Clerks and officers track movements on massive wall maps, directing thousands of heavy transport trucks across icy roads. The chaotic hum of an army pivoting north fills the stone building. Then, a dispatch rider walks through the front doors, carrying a red-bordered folder from Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. It is not an operational order or a warning about enemy armor. It is a strict administrative demand for a 40-page written log of every gallon of gasoline used by individual supply trucks during the previous month. The message carries a fixed 72-hour deadline. Patton will respond to this administrative distraction with an immediate, blunt message that echoes across the high command. His words will establish exactly where administrative routine ends and the reality of survival begins. This is the story of what happened when an administrative system demanded a detailed fuel ledger during the most critical tactical maneuver on the Western Front. It is an account of a field commander who refused to let bureaucratic routines interfere with the immediate survival of American soldiers trapped under siege. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show the war behind the war. Colonel Paul Harkins was 40 years old from Boston, serving as the Chief of Staff for the 3rd Army Headquarters. He was a career officer who understood the massive, crushing weight of military logistics, having spent months tracking the daily movement of food, ammunition, and fuel across Western Europe. Harkins had seen the cost of mechanical failure during the rapid advance across France, where stalled tanks became easy targets for hidden anti-tank guns. His primary responsibility was ensuring that the combat divisions had what they needed to fight, a task that required constant attention to detail and an absolute focus on operational reality. On this freezing afternoon, he sat at a makeshift wooden desk, surrounded by maps, telephone wires, and urgent combat reports, trying to organize the movement of thousands of vehicles through a blinding snowstorm. The sudden arrival of the administrative demand from higher headquarters forced him to halt his operational planning, staring at a document that threatened to consume the very staff resources needed to keep the Army moving. Major Robert Finch was 31 years old, an officer assigned to the Logistics Analysis Section at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, originally from an affluent neighborhood in Boston. He operated within a world of clean desks, organized filing cabinets, and strict administrative regulations far removed from the muddy realities of the front lines. Finch believed that proper documentation and standardized records were the true foundation of military efficiency, frequently stating that an army could not advance unless its paperwork was perfectly aligned with secondary regulations. He wore a crisp, tailored uniform without a speck of mud, and his polished leather shoes never touched the frozen dirt of an active combat zone. To him, the quarterly fuel report was a mandatory administrative task that required total compliance, regardless of local tactical situations or ongoing movements. He dispatched the strict directive to the 3rd Army Headquarters with the expectation that his paperwork would take priority over any immediate battlefield complications. The German offensive through the Ardennes forest had shattered the Allied line, creating a deep, dangerous bulge in the front. In the freezing cold of late December, the American forces holding the critical crossroads town of Bastogne were completely surrounded, low on ammunition, and facing constant artillery bombardment. The entire tactical balance of the Western Front depended on whether reinforcements could reach the trapped men before their perimeter collapsed entirely. Other field commanders along the line had accepted the administrative burden of secondary paperwork, allowing their staff officers to spend valuable operational hours compiling routine documents for higher headquarters during less intense periods. They viewed these administrative demands as an unavoidable reality of serving within a massive, multinational coalition that required centralized tracking. But those compliance choices had occurred during static phases, not during a massive operational crisis that threatened to alter the course of the war. The sheer volume of men and equipment moving across the icy roads required absolute focus from every available logistics planner in the theater. The coordination of fuel supplies, road clearings, and unit boundaries left zero margin for error, as columns of tanks rushed north through the snow. Every officer at 3rd Army Headquarters understood that a single miscalculated route or delayed supply column could cause the entire rescue operation to stall on the frozen roads. The focus of the entire staff was pinned to the tactical maps on the walls, tracking the progress of the lead combat teams hour by hour. The arrival of an ordinary quarterly accounting requirement threatened to disrupt that fragile planning environment at the exact moment the operation hung in the balance. The heavy stone headquarters building remained filled with the constant sound of ringing telephones and hurried briefings as the deadline approached. Harkins stood over the main plotting table when Finch walked into the operations room. The major adjusted his perfectly ironed wool coat and held out a formal folder. He said he needed the November fuel accounting sheets signed immediately. Harkins told him that the entire staff was rerouting 3 separate combat divisions toward Bastogne. Finch replied that the quarterly analysis schedule was fixed by Supreme Command. Harkins kept his voice flat and said that men were freezing to death in the snow 40 miles north. Finch looked at the large wall map and stated that administrative schedules could not be altered for local tactical movements. Harkins stepped closer to the table and told him the report would require 40 hours of specialized staff labor. Finch answered that 40 hours was a standard operational window for a logistical unit. Harkins pointed to the ringing telephones and the exhausted clerks working in the corner. He said his officers had not slept in 36 hours because they were moving 250,000 soldiers. Finch straightened his neck and stated that proper administrative records were the only way to prove theater efficiency to Washington. Harkins asked if the major understood that a delay in planning meant the relief columns would stall on the icy roads. Finch replied that if the fuel logs were incomplete, the Supreme Headquarters logistics models would be completely ruined for the winter quarter. Harkins said that his clerks were currently calculating ammunition weights and tank transport routes, not counting old gasoline receipts. Finch twapat his le argusur and stated that a field command did not have the authority to violate an official administrative directive from the Supreme Theater Commander. Harkins looked at the young officer and said that the lives of the trapped paratroopers depended on the speed of this headquarters. Finch answered that regulations were designed to survive individual battles, and that paperwork was the true foundation of a professional army. Harkins stated that he would not divert a single clerk from the operational maps during an active breakthrough. Finch raised his chin and said that refusal to comply with a direct logistical requisition would be noted as a deliberate failure of command discipline in his official memo. Harkins realized the young major had absolutely no conception of the violent crisis unfolding on the frozen roads outside. He told the clerk at the door to take the folder directly to the commander's personal office. The urgent notification concerning the administrative blockage reached Patton within the hour. Patton walked into the operations room unannounced. His winter coat was unbuttoned, showing the 4 silver stars on his collar and the ivory grips of his revolvers resting against his belt. The heavy boots clicked sharply against the stone floor, and the low murmur of the busy staff instantly died away as every clerk froze in place. He walked directly to the main plotting table, ignoring the map markers and looking straight at the young major from Supreme Headquarters. His face was completely still, his eyes cold and fixed. He did not raise his voice when he spoke, but the words carried clearly to every corner of the silent room. He asked the major what specific document he was holding in his hand. Finch replied that it was the mandatory November fuel utilization log for the theater records. Patton asked if the major knew that the Third Army was currently executing a 90-degree turn in a blizzard to rescue an surrounded division. Finch answered that he was aware of the tactical movement, but that theater administrative requirements remained unchanged. Patton asked how many staff hours were required to compile the requested breakdowns from the field units. Finch stated that it would take approximately 40 hours of standard clerical work. Patton asked if those 40 hours should be taken from the men currently calculating the route to Bastogne. Finch replied that records were essential for the post-war historical ledger. Patton studied the young officer for a quiet moment. He said that Supreme Headquarters wanted an account of gasoline, while the soldiers at the front were counting their remaining bullets. He stated that an army driven by clerks would produce flawless ledgers and dead riflemen. He noted that the men of the 101st Airborne were currently holding a freezing perimeter against 3 German divisions without proper winter gear or medical supplies. Every single clerk in this headquarters was working to save those lives, not to satisfy an administrative checklist in an office in Paris. He told the major that his administrative demand would receive an immediate and final response. He stated that the formal fuel ledger would be compiled only after the relief of Bastogne was entirely completed. He gave the officer 10 seconds to leave the operations room with his empty folder. He noted that if the paperwork interfered with the movement of a single ammunition truck, the major would find himself digging truck routes out of the snowbanks alongside the advance guard. Finch remained motionless for a second, then closed his leather case and walked out into the corridor. Patton took a fountain pen from the desk and pulled the official reporting slip toward him. The operations room remained completely silent, as the general wrote out his response in 30 seconds. He stated that the detailed fuel log would be submitted only when the Third Army had finished saving the trapped division. He noted that his current staff resources were entirely committed to the relief of Bastogne. He wrote that the fuel consumption for November was simply a lot, and added that further details would follow when soldiers stopped dying in the snow. He signed his name at the bottom with a sharp line and handed the paper back to the major. The young officer looked down at the handwritten message, his face turning pale under the dim electric lights of the headquarters. The operational staff watched in silence as the administrative directive was completely brushed aside by a single handwritten note. Finch turned without speaking and walked out through the heavy wooden doors into the freezing night air. The response was transmitted up the chain of command to Supreme Headquarters within the hour, bypassing the standard channels of military bureaucracy. No official at Supreme Headquarters attempted to challenge the delay or demand revision after reading the message. Patton returned to his planning maps immediately, directing his staff to resume tracking the northern fuel routes. Colonel Paul Harkins remained with the Third Army until the final surrender in Europe, coordinating the complex movements of the advance into Germany. After the war concluded, he returned home to Boston, continuing his military service for over 2 decades and eventually rising to the rank of 4-star general during the conflict in Southeast Asia. He lived a quiet retirement in Texas, frequently advising younger officers on the vital relationship between logistics and battlefield survival before passing away in 1984. He never forgot the Cold Stone operations room or the lesson that human lives take absolute priority over administrative compliance. Major Robert Finch returned to his analytical position at Supreme Headquarters, where he continued compiling quarterly transport summaries for the remainder of the winter. Following his separation from the service in 1946, he resumed his career in corporate administration in Massachusetts, remaining deeply committed to organizational efficiency and standardized procedures until his death in 1978. He spent his later years writing articles about tactical supply chains, maintaining a quiet bitterness toward field commanders who ignored administrative structures for immediate local results. General Patton recorded the entire administrative dispute in his personal diary that same evening, noting that the high command wanted him to count gallons while his soldiers were counting casualties. He kept a copy of the brief handwritten response in his personal desk drawer for the remainder of the campaign, viewing it as a necessary defense against bureaucratic interference. In a private letter to his wife, written 2 weeks later, he remarked that an army could always recover from late paperwork, but it could never recover from a delayed rescue column. Some historians have argued that the strict administrative oversight maintained by Supreme Headquarters was absolutely necessary to prevent a total collapse of the theater logistics network. They contend that without standardized fuel tracking and continuous resource reports, centralized planning would have failed across the entire European continent. Others have argued the opposite, insisting that rigid bureaucratic demands during an active operational breakthrough threatened the immediate safety of frontline units by draining vital leadership attention. They believe that field commanders required complete autonomy to respond to rapid tactical crises without interference from distant desks. What is certain is that the sharp response from 3rd Army Headquarters permanently established a clear boundary between office routines and battlefield realities. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have signed the official administrative papers to satisfy Supreme Headquarters? Or would you have ignored the bureaucratic system completely to focus every single mind on rescuing the trapped paratroopers? Let us know in the comments below, and if you want more stories about the war behind the war, make sure to subscribe.